Hi. So here we are.
So good to see you.
We're doing our unpodcast.
I know. I'm
still
so
human.
happy.
Still human after all these years.
And yes, I'm happy to report that that's still the truth.
I know.
Still the truth.
What's your take on vulnerability? You were telling me about this article.
Oh, right. There was this great article, and I highly recommend subscribing to Farnham Street. They're not paying us or anything, but they have great articles. I think they call themselves a signal in a world of noise.
Ooh.
But this article was about vulnerability, and a lot of people have heard the Brene Brown talk, which is absolutely
awesome.
Where
love her.
Like Brene Brown was kind of like, don't have time for vulnerability. But then what she kind of learned, and what I've learned over the years, is that vulnerability actually makes you stronger, because it takes more energy and more effort to hold up the wall of trying to appear perfect, of trying to appear like nothing affects you. Not to mention how boring it is when you're doing that.
Well, isn't that part of how you grew up?
Totally.
Right?
Totally. I mean, I come from an Irish background, and, not to put too sweeping a generalization out there, but at least in my family, if somebody did something good, you never told them about it. You talk about people behind their back. And the only thing that you tell people that's good about them is how wrong they did something, and that you've ruined it for life. So in my family, if you made a mistake, it was a lifetime mistake, right? So there was no chance of ever curing that. So you kind of had to be perfect.
Wow.
And you had to know everything. So, and actually, this is something that's known as fixed mindset, which is where you kind of label somebody and you say, you are a good singer, which means that everything you do needs to be good, right? Because you're a good singer, so I must always sound good. What labeling somebody like that does is it takes the
limiting, right?
Yeah, and the learning out of it.
And the pressure. I think so many people feel, I know I have been dealing with my own vulnerability issues, and I work with my clients on that, on being authentic and real and sharing your peeling back the cloak or behind the curtain. And this past week, I was having all kinds of vulnerability issues. I had to call Kathy to talk me off the ledge because, it's like I want to be real, but I also want to feel my most attractive on camera. And it is weird getting older. It is just weird, right?
Well, and we live longer than we ever used to, and we still place it into a category that has about maybe 60 years that it didn't have before, because in the early 1900s, we only lived to be about 47 or 48. So if you made it to retirement age, that was nice. You might have a few good years after that, and that's it. Today, we live so much longer. And so we're still dealing with this old idea of what age even looks like, right? And so
now we have sexy grandmas.
Exactly.
What? Right.
And I just heard a brand new term, and it's called middlescence.
Ooh.
So like adolescence didn't exist until maybe 50 or 60 years ago.
Okay.
When finally they realized that children are not little adults who should be working in factories. That maybe there's a phase they go through that brings them into adulthood.
Okay.
So that's what adolescence is. And so then you study it, you look at it, and then you give people a fair shot to have a decent life.
Right.
And what they're saying now is that between the ages of 45 or 65, and I'm not saying where I fit in that, if I even fit in that category at all, it's middlescence, and it's preparing you for the things that you're going to be doing later on in your life.
Wow.
So kind of coming up with that, because coming back to the whole idea of feeling old and all of that, I'm going to confess that when you called me, I had also had a reaction to seeing some pictures of myself, which was pretty much like, oh my God, I look like a barrel. And, oh
my God, I miss my waist.
Right. Oh. Exactly. I miss my waist. And that's also, remember, this is called Still Human for a reason, because what we're doing is talking about these things that happen in our lives, and we're talking about how we process them, or knowing that there are ways to even process them, to talk about them so we can let them go and just continue to live.
Right.
Otherwise, something like that would trip me up.
Right.
There's a time in my life where if I thought I looked like that, I wouldn't leave the house, or I'd do something I'd probably eat.
Right.
I would probably solve the problem of looking like a barrel by contributing to being more of a
Barrel. Yeah, I can relate to that. You know, I mean, I know there were times when I was working on different projects and people would be like, well, Elaine, we need you to look at your footage. And I'd be like, okay, yeah. And then I never would. And I would hold up whole teams of people because I could not look at myself.
Right.
And I've really had to work on that. And I work on that with my clients. And clearly, you know, I had to do some work this week about like, you know, learning, you know, what can you grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Oh. So,
yeah.
So, tell me more about that vulnerability article. Do you remember?
Yeah.
It was so good.
Well, the thing that they were talking about, so, and we know these phrases because we were talking about them earlier, that,
All right.
you know, when you're able to say things to someone like, I made a mistake.
I am sorry I caused you harm.
Right.
I don't know.
I don't know. Right. When you're able
I cried a lot.
We laughed, we cried, it became a part of us. But when we're able to say those things, you open up space for other people to be able to say, me too. You know, that is the same for me. You know, and I know that growing up, I was not allowed to be human because no one really knew what that was. I think some of it just even has to do with our evolution as a species.
Right.
Because, you know, I grew up with Depression era energy. It's just like, you never know when the next, you know, you don't have any luxuries, you know, and we live in a world today where we have many more luxuries. We have the luxury of time. Well, some of us do, not all of us do. But what I mean by that is that work now doesn't have to just be someone's got to work because there's no money. All the banks are closed or whatever.
Right. Or like in the old days, you had to work all day on the farm in order to make the food. And then it took hours to make the food and clean out. Like they didn't have.
And it was a life. But that was a whole life. And then the Industrial Revolution came in and said, all right, you're going to just do the udders. All right. And you're just going to do this. And then it's not part of a life. It's little bits and pieces of something that have no purpose.
Mm.
And so what we created over the years were people who work in assembly lines who don't feel a sense of purpose because they don't see what they're doing and how what they're doing is contributing to something else.
They're not connected.
And also the way that we kind of, as a society, don't understand the level of skill it takes to do things. You know, so many of the apps you have today, it's like, I'm going to become a person who sells all my clothes, you know, and no, I'm not. You have to pack your clothes. You have to price your clothes. You have to make you know, but there's this lure that you can just do it yourself. You don't have to hire anybody else, you know, and it's like, you know, being able to say you have mad skills in that area. I'm hiring you to do this thing. And that speaks back into sort of vulnerability of just sort of saying, I don't know everything.
Yeah.
Or even a lot of things, it's not bad.
It's so freeing. But I mean, I feel like I grew up in, you know, a very dysfunctional family. And so, but lots of good things came out of it, like learning how to read the room. You know, I can walk in and I can sense what's going on energetically with people. And it's so intuitive. It's so automatic for me. And I can kind of pull myself back or, you know, meet the energy where people are. And I really get that that's such a gift. However, it was not safe to be vulnerable in my family.
No. And I want to ask a question, which is, I've heard the term dysfunctional family. Would you say a little something about what that meant in your life? In my life. Yeah, I do think that's one of those phrases that's sort of tossed around a lot. And I'm certainly, although I've been doing transformational work for 20 years and tons of workshops and coaching and things, but for me, there was physical, verbal, mental abuse. There were several people in my family who were struggling with opioids, alcoholism, probably undiagnosed bipolar. We had somebody who went to prison. We've had quite a few suicides by shotgun, which is very typical in Texas, especially for older men. They start to lose it and they just go in the backyard or on the front porch. Unfortunately, that's really common, but nobody talks about it. But
so yeah, so I had the experience of, and I know that all three of my parents were doing the best job they could, but it was kind of crazy. And so, um, there was, it was not safe to be vulnerable. And so I find it fascinating that I am so vulnerable now. I mean, as a comedian, I'm constantly making fun of myself and my frailties and my mistakes and my wacky thinking, and also I've had the benefit of lots of therapy. So I have learned, I've sort of trained myself to be vulnerable, and I still have moments, I'm human. So it's interesting, but yeah, I mean, I think there's different levels of dysfunction. And what's cool, I mean, in the 12-step world, I went to a different meeting on Saturday that I haven't been to much. And I think there are like 120 different 12-step programs out there.
Wow.
And even if there's not like a physical meeting in somebody's where they live, there's like telephone and online. I mean, that's miraculous. And it's not a perfect program because it's human.
It's true.
And so take what you need and leave the rest, right?
Right.
And I mean, I have to say, I was listening to this guy and he was going on and on. A part of me is like, I can't do this. Shoot me. And then luckily, somebody that I knew and how I really respect his program, he shared. And I was like, okay, if you get one thing, then it was worth your time,
Yeah, it's such a life lesson,
Yeah.
like a microcosm of life, and just, the idea of, I love that saying of take what you need and leave the rest. It's like
Oh my
people listening to
God.
this podcast, you might get to a certain point and say, wow, I really identify with what these people are saying. And so you're going to want to listen more. But someone else might be like, what? I don't get it. That's why there are 120 different AA types of meetings. That's
Right.
why there are self-help books, entire walls in places of self-help books, and diets, all the different diets you can go on, because we are all
That's a dirty word. Okay, sorry.
food plan. I don't know, what would you call it? But I say that there are all those things out there because we are really individual. And I've said this before, the idea of us being complex.
Right.
We're not complicated. If we were complicated, I could just fix your ear and this would be all right. So if you were feeling depressed and you were complicated, there'd be something in there that was completely and directly linked to your depression. And it would also be the same for every other human being. But that's not how it is, right? There are so many contributing factors
Right.
to what that is. So that's the other reason why there's so much out there. So take advantage of
Right.
what's out there.
Well, and I always say, I feel like all roads lead to the same goal, right? To
Yeah.
be happy, joyous, and free, to feel comfortable in your own skin, to feel like you have some control over your life and that you're making a difference with your life, to love and be loved. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we are, our vote is that we have a lot more in common than we do different.
We really do. Seen a lot of examples of that, and by opening yourself up to being more vulnerable. And the sense is, it's really just to sort of say, like, I used to sit with staff. I'd have one-on-one meetings, and people would say, well, they, and I said, you're looking at her. They, when you talk about they in this organization, I'm they. I am a person. So when we have those conversations, well, they're doing this now, and then
Oh,
they're
they,
doing
right.
that. Well, we know what they looks like if we're willing to just take a look and say, that's they. And so I would just say, you're looking at they. Do you really think I sit around and have time to make up stupid things for you to do? And I don't mean that wasn't the only conversation. But the idea was that to say, no, there are human beings involved, and we forget that.
Right. Right. We
know?
totally do every day in work. So,
Exactly.
Kathy, will you, one of the things I love about you is you say some of the things I've only thought.
Oh.
And that to me is that's part of being humorous, comedian. Sometimes you just speak the truth and that's funny. Sometimes you have a take on the truth. So you've done, you did this thing when you talk about going to see, modern music.
Oh.
And because I
Yeah.
do love music, and I play
Yeah.
classical and I sing musical theater and a little bit of opera and whatever. But I've never really, there's some of the more modern things I've never quite gotten. And then you, gave me this fabulous example. Will you share that with us, please.
I will. I believe you were talking about bleep fart music. It's a genre. I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but here's the thing. I've seen and heard a lot of times the more modern sounds, if you see how they're being created, it makes it a lot more interesting. So if someone says, you know what, I'm going to go buy a recording of modern music or, contemporary music,
Strindberg or
they're like, don't do that because there's nothing to hear. A lot of it is in the making of the music. But there's this woman named Anna Russell who was just so funny. She used to do these fake recitals all over the country. And so she would just make up these arias that were just hilarious. But so Doug and I, my husband, we'd go and we'd hear something and we'd be like, that's bleep fart music. And it's basically like this because you can make fun of it. My heart is red. And and what is that? And the thing is, because I want to be a little bit careful too, because I don't want to just put down something, because there are certain things that are like easy to make fun of. We were talking about Hemingway, how the way he wrote was in these short phrases that made him ridiculously easy to make fun of. And it is kind of funny. But sometimes people are trying too hard. They're copying and they're doing something. And so something sounds like a caricature of what it really is.
Right.
And one time I was singing a piece, very, very modern, where I was singing the piece in one key and the piano was in a different key.
Oh, God.
And the composer said to me,
God.
don't worry, Kath. No one knows how it's supposed to sound anyway. And so then, is that the joke? Is that the experiment?
Who
knows?
Know.
But
I don't know. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And so back to vulnerability again. So you also mentioned how improv helped you lighten up and lose your preciousness.
Oh my God.
So do you think that doing improv helped you with your vulnerability?
Improv helped me because it was the exact opposite of how I lived my life. I used to plan everything. I want to know how things go. I couldn't even take a vacation because I had to know what the weather was going to be like. So I'd give a few years where it's like, it looks like the weather pattern holds up like around these 2 weeks. It was ridiculous.
Oh my God. So, I knew that you were into the Weather Channel. I had no idea.
Total weather maven. Anyway, but yeah, the whole idea, what improv did was it taught me how to live without a script. And it taught me to not be so precious about the rare times I was performing when I was younger, right? So if I were doing something and, I was going to be on the stage, I'm sorry, I can't talk right now because I'm in a play, and improv is sort of like, we have a gig, it's here, meet us there. It's at 10 p.m., it's at 11 p.m., it's at 1 p.m. You have these shows, 1 a.m. You have all these late shows, and you've got to just show up and produce. You can't just be, if you have a bad night in improv, you suck. Like, to the audience in that room, you are the worst performer ever, and that is a really helpful and instructive situation to be in, and to know that life still goes on. It's like, yeah, these people probably not going to come back and ask for me, but I learned something here.
You learned something, yeah. Right? And it helps you let go of some stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's one reason I love comedy so much, because I was, I was studying at the neighborhood playhouse and I had done all this training, but I was still, there was a preciousness about it too, because I loved it so much. I was too close to it. And there's nothing like getting on stage and getting on stage and getting on stage and eating it sometimes. And, but it really helped me like loosen up.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, because when you've had a moment on stage, let's say you're playing on stage with improv, and at one point, one of the troops I was with, they could get pretty hardcore and just try to mess with you on stage. Ooh. And so at one point, they came on and they just started speaking in a gibberish, and so that meant the whole scene fell to me.
Oh God!
And it was not a good night for me, and so it was so hard because instead of being able to come up with something, I froze. And you don't forget nights like that, but you also survive nights like that. Right. And you're like, oh, okay. Life goes on.
Woo! Right? Like, and that makes me think of, so one night I was in Portland, Maine, and I had opened the show and I was waiting to come back on stage to close the show as emceeing. And I, normally I'm like, kind of, I mean, every club is different. And for some reason I was like in the audience, and I thought that the headliner was wrapping up. And so I was like standing in the audience for a while, and I could just feel being right in the audience. The energy, the vibration was so high, and it felt like love. It felt like God. It felt like, and I just had this moment of like, oh my God, like I started off the show and everyone's like in their own world of like, how much is parking? Am I going to get laid? Where's the chicken? I'm hungry. I need a drink. How much is, like everyone's like in their own thing. And then they come together in this dark place, sitting close together, laughing at the insanity of being human and dealing with the modern world and whatever. And they become like a community. And I don't know. I just will never forget. I was still kind of new doing comedy. It was just like this moment of like, oh my God, this is love. Like, this is why I do this work.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so bonding. And it was, laughing at vulnerabilities and laughing at humanity and doing it together. It was such a beautiful thing. And anyway, just when I have a bad set, I try to remember that moment because it was such a cool moment.
Yeah, that's cathartic. And I think, the whole idea of when we share the vulnerabilities. So when I say, you know what, I'm not really sure what to do, I need some help with this, oftentimes you come up with a much better solution than if you tried to figure it out yourself.
Oh God.
When you start to, and the amount of energy it takes to hold up those walls is really extraordinary, really extraordinary. And we don't, our energy is precious. We want to use it in the right ways.
I love
I saw West Side Story last night, this new version of it. And it was a very similar thing of being taken on this journey, and you're in the room with all of these people and you're just going through the highs and the lows.
When you're a jet all the way.
Yeah. And the music. I mean, the music is just glorious. And I loved everything about this production. And it was that same thing of those moments, the beauty of art, the beauty of those moments where we're telling a joke and everybody's laughing together. We need that kind of contact. We don't need it 100% of the time.
Right.
It's something that's important for us humans to have. And it makes a big difference. I just think that's so powerful. I love that.
And I love what you said about the energy it takes to hold up the facade. I remember when I first did the Landmark Forum, and I was like, oh, you mean it's okay to say, I don't know? I was
dun, 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 dun.
Wow, that's allowed? Like I just, that was mind-blowing to me. And I continued after I did a lot of stuff with Landmark Education. I worked with Debbie Ford, and she would talk about how so much of her work was about integrating the shadow side, the parts of yourself that you don't like.
Yeah.
Like, ooh, sometimes I can be a bitch. Sometimes I feel fat and frumpy and frizzy. Like we all have these parts of our personalities and our humanness that we're trying to not let other people see. And she would say it's like a beach ball you're trying to hold underwater, and how much energy it takes because you're like, oh, no one can see this part of me. And then it pops out, which is passive aggressive, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Instead of, and I growing up in the South, trying to be, perfect and kind and nice, and I wasn't allowed to be angry. I wasn't allowed to express anger or passion. I was always like, shh, take it down a notch, Elaine, you're too much,
Right.
And so doing the Debbie Ford work I found so freeing. And I'll never forget, she was like, well, will you give me a testimonial? Because for a while I was really tight with her, and I was like, well, Debbie Ford helped me embrace my inner bitch. But it's true. Like if you can integrate those things, and that takes work and it's a whole process, but you can see that sometimes it's absolutely appropriate to be a bitch or forceful or whatever you want to call it in certain aspects. But when you do the work, you have a choice whether you're going to choose that aspect of yourself or you're just trying to like run from it and then it zaps out.
And
So-
that might be a sort of a challenge or something to put out there for people who are listening. Where are those, what are the parts of your life that you feel like are that beach ball that you're trying to hold underwater?
Yeah.
Just kind of be a social scientist and observe that. Where is it that you're really trying to hold that stuff down? And what would happen if you were to release it?
Yeah.
And I think the thing you were talking about earlier, Elaine, about reading the room, there is an element to that. So it can be fun to talk about these things and say, yeah, just let it out, be vulnerable, but read the room.
Right.
You don't just go to like the next person and share. So it is very important to also, when that moment comes, that that you think about who you want to be vulnerable with.
No,
who you want to share that.
That's a great point. In fact, that was the other point I had about our vulnerability points that we were talking about. I had a point about the points, with the points. About
what's your point?
Right. I'm getting to it. Shit. Sorry. No. Talking about how, yes, vulnerability is awesome. It's kind of a new, it's been kind of a cool phrase or whatever, but there is a time and a place.
Right.
And that we've all been on the receiving end when somebody we didn't know very well walked in and just dropped a big turd in the space, right? So, you want to be appropriate. And if you really need to go confess, go find a bartender, go find a priest, whatever. But like, you want to be, appropriate in your vulnerability moments and not use it to hold people emotionally hostage.
Right. It's sort of like, I always tell people to avoid the dry wells. If you're going somewhere and you need a drink of water, don't go to a dry well. Who are the people in your life who are not dry wells? Who are the people who can hear what you have to say and allow you to say it?
Oh, that's
so just
great.
kind of understanding what that is, because again, that's the power of it. And then also to allow yourself to sort of say, oops, that was a little bit of an overshare. That's okay.
Oh,
it's all right.
I've done that a lot.
Yeah.
But I love that, the dry wells. Like I've trained myself that, Elaine, if you're in a funky place emotionally, maybe you should call somebody who you love in recovery, maybe not people from your family so much. Right? Or the tough business coach kind of people. Like there's just certain people that maybe they're not going to be the most compassionate. Right. And, and I used to always reach for the non-available people. That used to be my specialty.
And then
too.
you get better at it, right?
Yeah.
Over the years, you could just get better at saying, yeah, that probably isn't the person I want to talk to.
Right.
And so part of that is just making those mistakes and then bouncing back from them and knowing that we're all doing that. That's what it looks like.
Yeah. We learned from it. Like they say in AA, they say, don't go to the hardware store for orange juice.
And there you have it.
Although these days, they probably have it at Home Depot. Let me check, because I was just there this week.
Well, I think, years ago, I think I predicted the big box stores. We had this friend, and we decided to create a store for him, and we called it Pete's Bank Pancake House and Chainsaw Outlet. And we thought that was just hilarious, because this is back in like the 1970s. It was like breakfast, bank, and buzz at Pete's Bank Pancake House and Chainsaw Outlet. And now, isn't that a big box store? Like, isn't that what they are now, right?
Oh my God, that's hilarious. That's like a tongue twister, what you just created.
But we spent a lot of time on it when I was younger, so it's a big topic. And I think the thing is that when you think about yourself as, I sometimes will think of myself as a social scientist observing something. It's one of the ways that I can move out of being super emotional about something, because that doesn't go away. I think there was a part of me that thought that as I grew older, as I hopefully grew wiser, I thought it was like this trajectory. It's just this nice line that goes up, and instead it looks like, it's just what
She's
it looks
drawing
like.
a crazy line.
I'm drawing a crazy line. Well, actually, I was just vocalizing a crazy line.
You were doing bleep fart music again.
I was doing bleep fart music again. Thank you. That is called Untitled. Thank you. But The thing about that is that our lives are like that. And so some of the habits that we have that we create, like whether it's, expressing gratitude, whether it's meditating, whether it's just taking a deep breath, yoga, you guys could name a bunch of things. Those are the stabilizing rituals that we have that help us as we kind of move our way.
Oh,
through
Kathy,
life,
and I love what you just said, how you thought that at a certain time you would have gotten through being, quote, emotional.
Yeah.
And that's so helpful because
Good news, bad news.
Right. Because I feel like that's one of the challenges is there's a part of me that feels like I should feel like I have arrived somehow, or that I should feel confident and totally in my body now, or that I should have my how I should be at peace with how I look now. People go, oh yeah, isn't it great once you hit 50 you don't care? I'm like, I still care. Call me vain, whatever. I still care a lot.
Right.
I'm not free.
Right.
I mean, I want to be free. I preach freedom. I'm working on it, but there are days I'm not free.
It's true, and I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you.
No, it's okay.
I am laughing with you. I am laughing with you. But you're right. It's
I just think that's an important point for people who are listening. That we're both accomplished coaches. We both have spoken and coached all over the place.
Yeah,
and we still have
everywhere.
grace.
Like you can't even imagine. But you're right. the idea is, I still get to live a life. Everything isn't undone. If you have a moment where that happens, it's not all over with. It's a moment. It's a moment. I think
it's a picture. It's a video, right? Like
it's a video.
My ego was getting so caught up in like what I wore and what I looked and how I didn't all that stuff. And it's like, Elaine, it's like it's one more credit.
Yeah.
Next.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So
it happens. You think about it. You develop a process for it, which is usually simple, like looking at it, calling up a friend, like we chatted, where we had our little moment from our pictures, and then guess what? It's gone.
It's gone,
and you move on, and you're at the next.
And that's freedom, and that's what I think we all want. So, if people want to know more about you and how some of your fabulous processes, how do they find you?
Oh my gosh, KathyKeegan.com. So easy, Kathy with a K,
and Keegan,
Keegan.
Very good.
How about you?
Well, they can come to Captivate the Crowd. That's with C's. CaptivateTheCrowd.com. I am so excited. We have finally finished the latest version of my website challenge.
Put it there. Woo!
Thanks so much, Kathy.
Oh, thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. And we'll talk to you next time.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye.